Chapter 2. The Princess Samantha sat at her dressing table and glowered at her reflection as her maids dressed her hair. She detested balls and loathed the hundreds of suitors who flocked around her, spouting empty flattery. "I've never seen a lovelier flower, Your Highness," or "Your eyes rival the brilliance of the stars, Your Highness." If I hear that one again, I'll vomit. It wouldn't be quite so bad if even one of them meant it. Sometimes she wished. She pushed the thought away. She was the heir to the throne. She couldn't expect romance. "Let us be painting your face tonight, Your Highness," Ardra begged in her North Courtian accent. Samantha's maid was as small and slight as the princess herself, and had hair so blonde it was almost white. "Yes, Your Highness," Malvina chimed in. "Lady Sheila's maid said just yesterday we couldn't possibly know our business, 'cause you never wear paint." Malvina, more of a typical Corflundian woman, was tall and broad, and not nearly as pretty as Ardra. "Lady Sheila!" Samantha snorted in disgust. Sheila wore so much paint she resembled some ghastly sea creature. Samantha knew she wasn't pretty, but she was fond of the freckles that speckled her nose, and thought the emerald-green brilliance of her gown set off her white skin and auburn hair beautifully. Besides being appallingly uncomfortable, paint would absolutely spoil the effect. The princess gestured towards a huge portrait that covered one wall of her bedchamber. "Do you think Danu wore paint?" Malvina shrugged. "The Princess Danu was said to be a powerful sorceress, Your Highness. She probably didn't need to wear paint to attract men." Samantha laughed bitterly as she thought of the army of men waiting below. I wish not wearing paint was all it took to scare them off. "They say Danu never married, and see how happy she is." Samantha yearned for Danu's freedom. The long-dead princess was laughing as she galloped across the fields. Danu's auburn hair flew out behind her in the wind. The stars on the forehead and chest of her horse shone against its gorgeous coat. Samantha loved this painting, which was just as well, because it was bolted to the wall and couldn't be removed without tearing her chambers apart. She decorated the rest of her bedroom to match. Tapestries of horses covered the walls. Her dressing table, armoire, and large four-poster bed had horses carved into the woodwork. A quilt, embroidered with horses and stars, was spread over the bed. The mantel over her fireplace were the figurines of horses, in gold, silver, jade, crystal, and precious stones. Every new ambassador added to her collection. "Your Highness, you'll be having to marry one of them eventually," Ardra persisted. "The king won't be letting you hold out forever. You are 17, after all. Your mother was only 13 when she married the king." "You needn't remind me, Ardra." Samantha picked up her silver-backed brush from her dressing table. The gift from the Nasirian ambassador was inlaid with an amber horse-stud. Diamonds marked the stars at its forehead and chest. She fingered it lovingly. "Do you think it's true Danu wore the horse-stud?" "So the bards sing of her," Ardra said. Malvina made an impatient noise in her throat. "And they also sing her kiss turned suitors into toads. You don't believe such nonsense, do you, Your Highness? Nobody can tame a horse-stud." "No, I suppose not." The princess sighed wistfully, then smiled at the toads that hopped around the feet of Danu's horse. "How I wish my kiss could do that." Finally, her maids finished weaving the jewels through her hair and attached the simple gold circlet of the heir. Samantha tried to take a deep breath, but was prevented by the tightness of her corset. "That's it. This is the last time I wear a corset. Have my dresses altered to fit without one. And don't lecture me about fashion. I'd rather be able to breathe." Before her maids could protest that her breasts were small enough with a corset, she left the room. She passed through her reception room. which was decorated in a similar style to her bedroom and contained more ambassadorial gifts. She paused in front of her favorite tapestry, a white mare at the edge of the forest, helping her newborn foal stand. Wishing she was heading for the stables instead of the ballroom, she forced her face into a court smile and left her chambers. Her 2 bodyguards bowed and fell in behind her. The princess couldn't remember a time when she hadn't been followed by 2 heavily armed men. She'd grown so used to them, she often forgot they were there. A full crowd tonight, of course. While the possibility of wearing a crown still exists, not even a deadly plague would keep the hordes away. The princess entered the vast ballroom. Behind the dais at the top of the ballroom was the king's standard, a brilliant yellow sun on a field of red. Next to it was a smaller standard in her own colors, the head of a white horse on a field of emerald green. The walls were lined with standards of all the noble houses of Corflandia. Most sported images of ferocious beasts or weapons of war. If I'm supposed to be maintaining a peace, why do I have to dance in a room that celebrates war? Her father claimed they couldn't redecorate the ballroom without the risk of offending one or more of the Corflandian noble houses. But Samantha doubted she'd like balls any better, no matter how the room was decorated. As Samantha moved through the crowd, the courtiers parted and bowed. All the men attempted to catch her eye, and the smiles of the women failed to mask their jealousy. She mounted the dais where her father and members of the royal council awaited. King Solar beamed at her. His long white hair and beard flowed around his head, giving him the appearance of the wise old man from the Bard's Tales. She bowed to him, and he quickly extended his hand, raised her, and gave her a kiss on the cheek. Despite his insistence that she marry, her father did love her. The princess knew she should consider herself lucky. Most royal children had no choice in a spouse, but her father had left her free to choose among the men of appropriate rank. But as she looked over the sea of hungry male eyes, the thought of marrying any of them nauseated her. If only marrying them didn't mean I had to bed them. Beside the king, Uncle Cadman smiled at her. Cadman, Duke of Tooth and Borsch, was her mother's uncle, and had been her father's chancellor since she was 2 years old. He had very bushy eyebrows that gave the impression he was always looking down on people. But he was one of the few members of her father's council she liked, and he was the only one who exhibited no designs on the throne. His only son had married before she was born. Immediately after the king announced the opening of the ball, Arbital, the Duke of Hangriff, stepped forward to claim the first dance. No one else ever dared ask her until the Duke had had his turn. Like every Corflandian man, Arbital was tall, broad-shouldered, and blue-eyed. Many of the girls found him handsome. Samantha wasn't sure why. He was nearly twice her age. He was dressed in a surcoat of black leather, with long black velvet sleeves trimmed in gold and crimson braid. He had several thick gold chains around his neck. From the largest of these hung a pendant of a panther, the symbol of his house. In defiance of court fashion, he wore his blonde beard and hair cropped short. He and Duke Sheen were her closest living relatives on her father's side. Not that they were very close, third cousins or something. Both had thought to inherit the throne until her birth gave Solar a direct heir. Arbital bowed. "May I have the first dance, your highness?" "I'd be honored, your grace." She smiled her fakest smile and accepted his hand. As the dance began, the Duke bowed low over her hand, sliming it with a kiss. "Your highness, you are the brightest star in a shining crowd tonight." "It's only the first dance, and I get the star thing already? Is there some book they all read? 52 Compliments for Ladies? A Beginner's Guide to Flattery?" The Duke danced stiffly as if he disapproved of frivolity. "Your dress is Sinoian silk, is it not, your highness?" "No, it's Nasirian. I find the weave so much finer, don't you?" The silk did feel delightful against her skin, but she found talk of fashion and fabric tedious. She never understood the other girls' obsession with it, just as she never understood why they giggled so much. "So I have heard, your highness, but it is very difficult to come by. The Nasirians are more interested in trading in spices than silk." This was true, but equally boring, so she smiled and made some inane comment. When the dance finally ended, Arbitos slimed her hand again. "Perhaps we can share another dance before the evening's end, your highness." Samantha merely smiled, surreptitiously wiping her hand on her gown. Only if all 7 of the hells freeze over. The next suitor in line was Lord Devon, Duke Sheen's oldest son. Devon was only a couple years older than the princess, but he looked younger. His chin was covered with only the lightest and most delicate of fuzz. The princess thought he'd look better if he shaved, but of course he couldn't do that. Only the clergy shaved. May I have this dance, your highness?" As the dance began, Lord Devon turned a dozen shades of red. Your highness looks just like a flower tonight." It was obvious he didn't want to dance any more than she did, but Duke Sheen was bent on controlling Corflundia through his son. She'd heard the Duke had threatened Devon with the lash to force him to court her. Devon was only comfortable among his paints and canvases. Besides, he was in love with Count Morfrin's daughter, Lady Aslan. She wished just once some man would look at her the way she'd seen Devon look at Aslan. Samantha noticed blue under his fingernails. "And how is your latest creation coming? Working in blues, I see." Devon gaped. "I'm doing a seascape, your highness, but how could you know?" When she glanced at his fingers, he curled his fingernails into his fists. "Your highness, how could I be so neglectful? My father will kill me." Devon was a nice boy, but she wished his father would leave him to his art and his lover. After Devon, the princess worked her way through her father's council. Count Kane, Count Wayland, Baron Arwen's son, and a host of other nobles of varying degrees of importance. Nola, Count of Merlid, looked on wistfully. The count was nearly as round as he was tall, and it was rumored he'd do away with his wife if he thought he stood a chance of capturing the princess's hand. He had a 5-year-old son, and Samantha thought it a wonder Nola didn't send the toddler to court her. The king went to bed at midnight, but Samantha was forced to stay and dance with suitor after suitor. "Might I dance with the stars of heaven tonight?" Count Padarin, the only member of her father's council with whom she hadn't yet danced, asked. He always danced with her late in the balls. Maybe he felt he was saving the best for last. He wore a surcoat of bright turquoise edged with yards and yards of delicate lace. His hair and beard hung in long blonde ringlets. The princess smiled a court smile and took his hand. She cringed at the smoothness of his palms. "The damn fool doesn't even know how to wield a sword." The hands of most of the men at court were like hers, rough and callous from weapons training. As they whirled around the ballroom floor, a soft glow of rotten orange erupted around Pandaren. A steaming heat seeped from the orange and poured over her, coating her body with a slime so thick a dozen baths wouldn't cleanse her. The princess nearly cried out in despair. "Not the colors again! I thought I'd gotten rid of them." It had been several months since she spent all night kneeling at the altar in the palace chapel and praying for the goddess's help. She'd felt the goddess's peace and thought the terrifying colors gone forever. But again she'd been wrong. When she'd first seen the colors, she'd gone in disguise to the Temple of the Mother's Love. It was the only time she'd ever given her bodyguards the slip. She confessed her sins to a priest and told him about the colors. The priest had insisted she was under the influences of the denizens of darkness, and that her soul was in great peril. He'd performed an exorcism, but it hadn't worked. Nothing had. Maybe it's not demons. Maybe I'm insane. The princess was so upset after her dance, she fled the room without giving an explanation. She ignored the questions from her bodyguards and her maids, but she was shaking by the time Ardra and Malvina had finished undressing her and taking down her hair. When she was finally alone, she curled up into a ball on her bed and prayed to the goddess.